I'm sure you've seen there's been, I'll call it mixed reaction to the DA leader, John Steenhuisen's trip to Ukraine, which of course has been invaded by Russia. When he left South Africa last week, the leader of our official opposition said he wanted to see for himself the impact of the Russian invasion. Steenhuisen's also been tweeting his experience in Kiev. To talk more about the impact of his visit to Ukraine, we're joined now by Angelo Fick, Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute. Angelo, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. It seems that most people are spending more time criticizing John Steenhuisen and his trip rather than praising him. Why has this landed so badly?
Well, I think firstly, John Steenhuisen tends to elicit quite a lot of negative reaction across social media platforms, and so that was the inevitable consequence. And I think the second issue that sort of more serious critics might have of Mr. Steenhuisen's visit is that it isn't entirely clear what it is that he wants to do there other than assess the impact and the reality on the ground, and why it is that he thinks he'll be able to do something that a whole range of other people who've been reporting on this wouldn't be able to do better. But, you know, this is not new in the Democratic Alliance. We've had official opposition in South Africa. The leaders of that party visit other countries to do assessments. So John Steenhuisen is not the first DA leader to do so either. Mmusi Maimane has done this before, and with similar or analogous and comparable kinds of reactions from the public.
So is the problem the trip itself, or is the problem John Steenhuisen? To put it another way, I think there have been one or two moments. I think at one point, it may seem strange to say this now, but Helen Zille had, I think, respect from many people when she was beginning her term as leader of the Democratic Alliance. Does John Steenhuisen just not have that respect?
I think one of the issues that surround John Steenhuisen seems to be that his interactions on social media in his earlier phases have been a little more combative than they needed to be. He seems to have calmed down on that a little bit. But I think one of the other problems that John Steenhuisen became the focus point of is that people's problems with the DA's policies, positions and practices became focused on John Steenhuisen and on personalities in the DA. Let's not forget that Natasha Mazzoni was subjected to similar kinds of interactions. The problem with this, I think, is a combination of two things. It's both that the trip might be an interesting thing to do if South Africa were a more significant player in the global political economy, and if the relationship between South Africa and Ukraine or South Africa and Russia was a different kind of arrangement, in which case one would have wanted a BRICS delegation to go, and, you know, then an opposition party member, the official opposition, being part of that BRICS delegation might have had more weight and interest. But for the opposition party that's decreasing in numbers of a country on what Samir Amin used to call the marginal periphery to be involved in this global conflict and not clearly signaling in the information he's sending us on Twitter about his visit there, he's adding nothing new, nothing specific that we would know, and nothing that isn't rather anodyne and rather bland. For him to tell us that he's seen confirmed evidence of human rights violations, this is not new information. We've had this from other and far more credible sources who've been immersed in Ukraine for much longer prior to this particular visit.
The other issue is that this is a political leader, he's a leader of an opposition party, going to a country that we have diplomatic relations with, that is currently at war with another country with which we have diplomatic relations. I can't imagine that Dr. Naledi Pandor was pleased when she heard that John Steenhuisen was going to Ukraine.
Well, Dr. Pandor is probably best placed to answer what her department's official position would be. But I do think that there would be consequences coming to the South African government asking questions because, again, not all countries work in the democratic way that we imagine South Africa should work, and therefore the response to any politician from another state arriving in the zone, that's an issue. But John Steenhuisen is also not the only figure who has entered Ukraine. Ukraine has become a space in which several politicians around the world are beginning to find some kind of way of trying to address domestic unease with them by being sort of involved and commenting on the international space. We've seen this with Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, making a visit there in order to deflect attention from his particular domestic issues. And this, again, is not new in international statecraft. When there are issues at home that are problematic, nothing like visiting a war zone, helps, or visiting a conflict zone, helps a politician deflect from their domestic problems into this international space. I think for John Steenhuisen, the problem is the ways in which he's connecting that particular international conflict with local issues seems a little bit naive and a little bit shallow. I think that there is much more complexity to it. John Mearsheimer has spoken of this, the professor of international politics at the University of Chicago. He's given us immense detail on this. Noam Chomsky has given, sophisticated details on what it is that's going on in Ukraine. And so reducing this to heroes and villains, to bullies and victims, is one, simplistic, and it doesn't serve either the cause or the need for peace and resolution of the conflict, and seems to be much more geared at doing something in the domestic sphere that presumably will be about the official South African government position that as the opposition he wishes to critique. And that's a legitimate exercise. I think it is the duty of the opposition to interrogate the official government position. Whether a visit to Ukraine was necessary is a different question.
Could there be another issue here, which we've seen the Democratic Alliance going more towards, let me use the phrase, its base, and I'm talking, I suppose, primarily among white voters. We've seen that it's certainly lost support among black voters over the last 3 years. There are many reasons for that. I would imagine that many older white South African voters who perhaps grew up during the Cold War have an almost knee-jerk antipathy. They don't like Russia. They don't trust Russia. It doesn't matter that Russia's changed since the Cold War. They still have that sense. Could this have been an attempt to try and sort of ignite that vote in some way?
It is possible. I mean, we are rather far away from elections that could be affected by this. But my sense is that Mr. Steenhuisen may be positioning himself into a place where he can critique the South African government's official response to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and then use this visit by saying, I've got evidence, I've been there, I've seen the following things. And I think that's just politics. At some point one does have to ask, though, whether there weren't more credible and useful ways of doing this. I mean, this is a space that has also been commented on and researched fairly well, and whether Mr. Steenhuisen going into that space necessarily had the expertise, had the knowledge, had the research background to make sense of what was being said to him by Ukrainian officials, and could he place that in a specific context. Because, again, this is not as simple as, there is one bully and there are victims. This is a conflict that is also not new. It has been brewing for, at least in this articulation of it, for at least a decade, but it is the consequence of unresolved business of the Cold War. And so if we are to reduce his response to simply speaking to older voters who remember a certain kind of construction of the Soviet Union and of the Cold War, that would be as unsophisticated as I think, many existing responses are that aren't helpful. I'm self-confessedly not an expert on that, but the people that I follow and whose insights, John Mearsheimer and Noam Chomsky, among others, and their commentary on what is going on in there is that this is a much bigger problem than simply aggression from Russia. Their history around NATO, the settlement around the Cold War involving Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and George Bush Sr. that hadn't been respected, that were reversed under the Clinton administration and has worsened over the years. And that this is, the failure of the Partnership of Peace that was suggested by the Russians in the 90s to undo the kind of conflict that we now see and the potential for it of the European war. These are all there. And I suspect that Mr. Steenhuisen might have to, at some point, think very carefully about how he's going to position his responses in the wake of the far more sophisticated readings we're hearing from people who've studied it for decades, including, as I keep mentioning, John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago.